United States, the land of the free, is particularly rich in museums. And that's appropriate, because museums are a means to freedom. Here we can move out of our own personal anxieties and disappointments into the vast and stable world of human creativity. So I've come to America to see just 6 of her many great museums, to delight in the most beautiful objects from all cultures and all centuries that men and women have fashioned. Now I'm in Cleveland, where the Museum of Art is one of the great glories of the city.
Funding for this program was provided by the annual financial contributions to your PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
Cleveland is full of surprises. The newcomer finds an elegant city with its broad streets and its tall buildings facing out across the shores of Lake Erie. And for visitors only familiar with her industrial past, Cleveland's cultural treasures come as an even more pleasurable discovery. There are the Cleveland Orchestra and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for music lovers of all persuasions. And for art lovers like myself, there's one of America's gems, the Cleveland Museum of Art. Here I have found a surprising treasure house in itself, and not just literally with the gold and jewels of the medieval Guelph treasure. Cleveland has taught me afresh that museums are about expanding one's horizons, continually learning new things. I had no idea that there was early Christian art as great as these figures from the Eastern Mediterranean, showing the story of Jonah and the whale. An ancient Chinese scroll taught me to look at landscape in a new way. And even before one enters the museum, it has a trick up its sleeve. Several museums have a cast of Rodin's thinker, but Cleveland alone has the striking distinction of owning a Rodin's thinker exploded. In 1970, in that time still of radical protest, a bomb was laid here. And 900 pounds of bronze fell violently to earth. Since this is an authentic cast from Rodin's studio, the museum decided not to try to restore it, which would blur that authenticity, but to conserve it as it is. Of course, the original thinker was only 27 inches high, and it stood 13 feet up on the very top of Rodin's Portals of Hell, that masterwork, from which the thinker would look down and see the folly of human nature, and bewildered, try to make sense of it. Now, the Portals of Hell was never finished, and Rodin decided to expand the thinker. But he still wanted it placed very high, which of course has always been a problem for museums. It's a special problem for Cleveland, not because of the sighting, which is superb, but because of the damage. Rodin said that his thinker didn't just think with his head. He thought with his whole body, with every muscle, with the legs and the gripping toes. Now, of course, with that height, it's those gripping, thinking toes that viewers would most come in contact with, and as you see, they are gone. However, If one can draw any benefit from such an act of senseless vandalism, it's this: that here the thinker isn't perched aloft above human conflict. He's been plunged into it. He's exposed as vulnerable, as subject to the chaos of the world as we are. And that makes him peculiarly and tragically accessible. Art lets us see the world in a new light, and Cleveland has some particularly fine examples of the different ways that artists have tried to capture a vision of real life. It's 1872, and the American painter Thomas Eakins has just finished his art studies in France. And he's come back to Philadelphia. But he's 28, and most of his friends are married and have good jobs, and he's still living dependent in his father's house. His parents were willing to support him, but they weren't all that well off. And I think with that mid-Victorian ethos, he felt anxious. And perhaps that's why at this point in his career he was so attracted to the river. Not just because, like many Philadelphians, he loved rowing, but because there on the Schuylkill he was manly with the rest, equal to anybody. Of course, he wasn't equal to the Bigland brothers, who were the most famous team in the States. They lived in New York, and they had issued an international challenge to pair-oared racing. The only ones to take them up were a bold couple from Pittsburgh. Eakins became friends with them. He did countless sketches of them. He painted them. And on this, the big day of the race, the Bigland brothers turning the stake is his masterpiece. Typical, he chooses not the moment when the race is won, but the moment of greatest uncertainty. This is the one time when they don't pull together. John has to keep absolutely still while Barney works out with his head turned the complex calculations of getting them round that stake as efficiently as possible. This is a moment when all could be lost, like passing on the baton in a relay race. Notice all the spectators lining the banks. They can't see what we see. We're in the water. We can feel its liquid coolness. Literally, he painted himself in, waving his handkerchief, as a means of cheering on his friends to their victory. But metaphorically, I think it had a deeper meaning. By now he knew that he'd painted a great picture, that he'd given the whole feel of that enchanted day on the river. And he was cheering on the determination of the Biglands to win as rowers, and his own determination to win as an artist. Eakins stops the world to give us a moment in time. In the moving world of the 20th century, an American woman, Susan Rothenberg, pictures another sporting event. With Susan Rothenberg's title, Vaulting, I don't think anyone will have any difficulty with this image. You can see the pole at the top, And you can see the vaulter being caught in stopwatch, split-second moments as he soars over and down. And because it's vaulting, not a vaulter, there's another green figure, as opposed to this man with the black pants, to keep it general. So I think you can read it all right. But there may well be some out there who are saying it, why does she paint it like that? Why doesn't she do it clearly? So if there are any mumblers and grumblers, you'll enjoy this story. That just before she painted this, she went back to drawing school. She's a very conscientious woman, Rothenberg. And she signed herself as a housewife, and the instructor hadn't a clue that she was a famous artist. And he thought her work was terrible. He said, what are you using those hairy lines for? I want you to look and observe and use a clean, simple, clear, nice line. What, of course, he didn't realize, that though that may be fine advice for beginners, a mature artist can't pick and choose. She didn't want to paint a moving body. She wanted to focus on the body as movement. And you can see it's not a vaulter with a background. The whole world is the experience from within of what it's like to move swiftly. You can see how the whole canvas seems to tremble with this constant movement of the world around the mover. It's almost as if that's the end of movement. Defeat. Controlled chaos. And it's that controlled but intense anxiety that this image seems to me to convey with such haunting power. This is the only museum I know of that has had a whole gallery dedicated to still life. Now that's a brilliant idea, but it's also a bold one, because even in 17th century Holland, when still life was at its zenith, it was criticized. It was considered the lowest form, and those who painted it were foot soldiers in the army of art, mean of spirit, who only painted things instead of people and events. And yet what hypocrisy, because everybody loved it, and we still love it. But why? This is Still Life with Two Lemons by Claes, a typical 17th century Dutch masterpiece. I think we love it best because it's so convincing. We really believe that those objects were before his eyes, and he has recreated them for us so that we can almost smell the lemon. And we see the sparkle as it really was in that glass and on the pewter plates. After I'd looked spellbound, I noticed something I hadn't seen at first. There's no narrative to this picture. It's not a breakfast. What are the lemons doing? There's no shellfish, there's no pancakes. Even if they're going to squeeze it into the water or the wine, 3 lemons is a lot. And there's olives at the back. You begin to realize that Claes has painted them simply because he liked the look of them. He wanted to paint those ovals, those glorious colors, so subdued and yet so bright, with the lemon, the sole source of vivacity, as it were, in the picture. Even the rococo curls of the wet lemon, you feel are there because he liked the look of it. He so enjoyed what he was seeing. He so enjoyed recreating it, and he shares that deep, rich enjoyment with us. It changes the way we look at things. We see them afresh. Cleveland has several unique treasures associated with the pleasures of the table. This tureen looks almost as if the food itself has been dipped in liquid silver. And imagine a 14th century banquet with this glittering fountain at the center of the table, water cascading from gargoyles onto a maze of wheels and bells. But I think one of the most intriguing pieces in the whole museum is this raft cup by Zhu Bishan, the great 14th century Chinese silversmith. These raft cups, of which he made several, all different, are unique. This one was in the emperor's collection. And the stone that this well-fed traveler is carrying tells us what the story is. Written on it is loom supporting stone. And that refers to a fable about a man who was traveling along a river on his raft when he found that he was lost. And on the bank, he saw a maiden weaving and a herdsman. And he asked them where he was, and the maiden simply gave him the stone that supported her loom and told him when he was home to ask an astrologer. He got home and he did ask. And the astrologer said, didn't he know that in the Milky Way there was a star called the Spinning Maiden and another called the Herdsman? And that very night between them, had seen a small star wandering. He'd been in the heavens. Now, the importance of that story is made clear in a verse that's engraved on the back. You went to the heavens, and you only brought back a stone. Why didn't you seek the brocade of the heavenly weaver? For all its glorious complexity, this is still a cup. The wine goes in there, and you drink it out of there. And every time the emperor lifted it, he would be eyeball to eyeball with the face of that blissful traveler who lost his opportunities, a look of happiness and yearning. And who was more in that position than the emperor? The man who had it all and could waste it all. And with every sip, he would be reminded of that. At an ancient Chinese feast, the vessels would have been laid out on low tables. Low because they sat cross-legged on the floor. The Chinese called the Western habit of using chairs, sitting with legs hanging down. And when there was a state banquet, people sat on woven cloths, which were anchored at each end by a heavy weight. And this bear is one of those weights. He came from a tomb of an aristocrat who lived at the time of the Western Han, 2,000 years ago, give or take 100 or two. Now, the Western Han had a special affinity for the bear. It was a star sign. They revered its strength and its power. But, you know, anybody who's lived near bears, the Native Americans, say, or the Russians, have felt this affinity. Even I, who've never seen a bear, feel a mystic closeness to this animal. And I like to think of the aristocrat who took his bears and his mat to his tomb with them, must have sat through many a state banquet, through the interminable speeches and the mindless toasts, and consoled himself by looking at the good-humoured power of his own personal bear. Let me take you on a journey, the sort of journey that's only possible in a museum like this. Here, time and geography cease to matter. We can witness combat from 20th century New York or from before the Roman Empire. We can marvel at the closeness to nature of the ancient Egyptians or the Chinese who made our Han bear, and compare them with a mysterious jungle encounter from another era, another continent. At the turn of the century in Paris, Picasso's circle, young and brilliant, got a great deal of amusement out of Rousseau, old and absolutely untrained as an artist. They called him le douanier, the customs officer, though of course he'd never been in such a lofty position. He'd sat at a toll gate, and even that he'd given up, because he was convinced that he was a genius of an artist. And the remark that really had them rolling on the ground in mirth was when the old man turned to Picasso and said, "You and I are the two greatest artists of the era. You in the Egyptian style, and me in the modern style." Well, I don't know what he meant about the Egyptian style, but this is certainly not the ancient style. It's a strange and wonderful picture. And I'm not sure to what extent Rousseau believed he was a genius, because he lived a fantasy life. He said he could paint all these pictures of jungles because he'd been there, whereas in fact he'd only been to the zoo. In this picture, the fight of the tiger and the buffalo, he'd seen the buffalo in a child's book of reproductions, Animal Friends. And you can see he's only seen the bananas on sale because he's got them all growing upside down. And this so-called fight, well, they're frozen. There's no vitality. He's not really in the least interested in trying to show a life and death encounter. What he's interested in is his own private world. That world of Rousseau which is so other from anybody else's world, and which he can create, and into which he can draw us. It's impossible not to be enthralled by the strangeness and the somehow convincing otherness of a work like this. Poor Rousseau, with his Picasso painting in the Egyptian style. If he could have left his fantasy world and walked through Cleveland's Egyptian galleries, he would never have confused Picasso's flamboyance with a culture that hardly changed its artistic style in 3,000 years. Amenhotep III was one of the great pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. In fact, one of the great pharaohs of any dynasty. It's not rare to find an image of him. And this museum has a particularly beautiful one. This noble head, wearing the blue crown, which was the cultic crown, which said he stepped forth to embody Egypt. And there's that wonderful smooth face with the huge almond-shaped eyes and the sensual lips, a brooding face. It keeps us at a distance. It's meant to. It gives us no hint of what it was like to be Pharaoh, which meant to be Egypt. If you want to understand that, you have to turn to another masterpiece at Cleveland, and this one is truly rare. These two-colored panels, two-colored blocks from a temple that Amenhotep built, and very fortunately it was pulled down and the blocks were laid face down so that the color has never vanished. It's still as bright and fresh as when the artist worked on it, using 16 different colors and glazes. Amenhotep appears here 5 times. One time, it's just his foot. Now, Egypt, like all big countries, was divided into administrative districts, which were called nomes. And because the pharaoh was Egypt, he was the god of each nome. And here he appears as a nome god, offering the produce of each district to the gods. It's a masterpiece of intricate and amusing detail. You have that lovely duck sitting with such self-consciousness on the back of the bullock. And then there's those pomegranates hanging from Amenhotep's arm, and this baby ostrich, which ostrichologists can say is exactly 4 months old. They can tell by the feathers and the look of the little tail. Then if you look more closely, you'll notice that as he is bowed down under the weight of the produce of his districts, his pendulous women's breasts become very visible, and that rather suspiciously pregnant-looking belly. Well, he is showing himself as male and female because he is Egypt, and the fertility, the fruitfulness of the country depends upon him. The American George Bellows has one unique distinction as an artist. He's the only major painter who financed his beginning in the art world by his earnings as a semi-pro baseball player. And you could perhaps deduce from his work that he had that keen eye and love for physical movement of a great ball player. But he didn't paint ball players. His great series were on boxers, a sport in which he had no interest, he said. My guess is that he was half attracted and half repulsed. Here was this good Methodist boy, up from the country, and he finds right opposite his studio in New York is Sharkey's Athletic Club. And that was just a way of getting around the New York laws against boxing matches. Now, if you look at the kind of people who've come to watch, you can see that Bellows didn't respect them. They're sleazy to a man. And of course, to a man, because this is stag night, no woman would have demeaned herself by going to watch something like this. But I think stag's a pun. Because you know how stags in the mating season fight, and they fight brow to brow. Often their horns lock, and the two great animals sway to and fro. If Bellows felt an amazed disgust for the viewers, he didn't feel that for the boxers. He admires them. He admires the courage. He's painted them in full motion. It's almost as if the way the paint slurs and blends, that any moment they will break from this clench, and the referee's there behind holding out his arms in readiness for it. But of course, they never do break. I think he admired them both so much he couldn't bear to have one lose. So forever, they're forehead to forehead, locked in combat, gleaming there, lifted up above the throng. Images of male courage, of grace under pressure.
Two 2,500 years before Bellows, these warriors were the handle on an Etruscan jewelry box. The Etruscans flourished in Italy before the Romans, and their art is often rather cruel. And yet there's nothing more tender in the whole museum than this little sculpture of death and sleep, bearing away the body of Sarpedon, one of the Greek heroes from Homer's Iliad.
Sarpedon is so young, so beautiful, and so very dead. The way his head lolls back and that great mane of hair flows on his arm, flips down. And death and sleep, armored and winged, are so grave, so reverent, so concentrated as they bear him away. And I think the owner, who must often have held that handle, must have pondered as to how you can't tell which is death and which is sleep. He or she treasured this and took it into the tomb, where, of course, fearsome death and gentle sleep are indistinguishable. Since the museum opened, I'm told, the one unforgettable memory of Cleveland children has been the excitement of the armor court. And I can believe it. Even for the staid and elderly, it's a romantic place, but ambiguous. How ironic that the accoutrements of war, weapons and armor, should be among the most magnificent things ever created. Well, the consolation is that the more exquisite the armor, the less likelihood that it was ever risked on the field of battle, as you can see. This glorious half-suit was made in 1490 by the greatest Milanese armorer, Pompeo della Cesa, and it was a fashion statement, a symbolic emblem of one's wealth and position and power, the most expensive male attire ever thought of. If you had enough money to order a Pompeo, and remember kings and dukes were eager to commission him, then he would come and measure you and bring his fashion book, in which you would pick out exactly what embellishment you wanted. And beneath, there'd be the swelling breeches, brightly colored, and brightly colored, different colored stockings. You would look very splendid. And you would only need a half-suit because aristocrats were supposed to take part in tournaments, and this was the foot tournament, fought over a barrier, so you were completely safe beneath the waist. You were really also completely safe above the waist, because the aim was not to hurt your opponent, but to touch him.
whoever played this man at the tournament once was a Bulgarian who made the bad mistake of actually bashing him on the helmet. Clearly, he knew no better. There are only about 40 of these Pompeo suits left, and about 20 of them have his signature across the front. This man was more sophisticated. He obviously felt if you couldn't recognize an original Pompeo when you saw one, then you didn't deserve to know. Now, looking round this court, I can think that many of these pieces knew fear and blood. But this piece was predestined from the start to stand in a museum.
A century before Pompeo forged this armor in Milan, Italy, the Queen of Spain, Isabella, was presented with an exquisite illuminated prayer book.
It's in such perfect condition that we can tell she didn't use it much. But I hope she did use it in 1497 and 98 and in 1500, because in those years she had great griefs. Her son died, her daughter died, her grandchild died, and this picture, for example, might have been such a consolation to her in her sorrowing. It's the massacre of the Holy Innocents. King Herod learned that Jesus had been born, and because he couldn't find him, he ordered that all the male children under 2 should be killed. And you'll notice how the soldier in the front is pressing his heel against the edge of the picture, as though violence always wants to erupt, and only creativity can control it. There's such ugliness in the 2 slaughterers, and such pathetic helplessness in the women and children. And yet, over the river, you can see Mary and Jesus escaping. The sacrifice of these children will mean life to others. And it's all set in these pages glowing with flowers and butterflies, the beauty of the world, which is such a consolation when our heart is sore. Of all the beautiful books of prayers, this one has a special connection with America.
In 1492, Isabella had sent Christopher Columbus off to discover a new world in the West.
And I think she would have been astonished and joyful to know that her prayer book has come to rest in that distant and almost mythical land.
Columbus himself never saw what is now the United States, but from the very beginning, Americans, both Native Americans and later arrivals, have had a clear sense of the majesty of their landscape.
Church's Twilight in the Wilderness could only be an American painting. It's filled with that sense of the sublimity of the country. He'd gone to South America and painted the Andes, and he'd painted Niagara Falls and icebergs. And each time he had a one-painting exhibition. And people came awed because they hadn't seen these things before. Here he's painting in the East Coast, his own Maine. And the extraordinary thing about this wonderful valley is that everybody who looks at it seems to have a different interpretation. Some home in on the eagle right up there, and they say, oh, the American eagle. And some look at where branches cross and think of Christianity. And some people, noticing that there's no human being there, have said, the pines are our suffragate, standing tall and strong as we are meant to do. Well, the pines I notice are these twisted, rather scruffy ones, which gives a wonderful air of convincingness to the landscape. No, but the interpretation this museum has, which I agree with, is based on the date. It's 1860. And the menace in the sky is all too real because the Civil War is about to begin. And that boiling, blood-red tide will soon become something experienced emotionally right through the country. And it's interesting to compare it with the great painting next to it. Bierstadt was an almost exact contemporary, and he's painting in 1866. The war is over and all is at peace, and he's painting in the West. These vast places that nobody in the East had heard anything of except rumors. Photographers were now going. Bierstadt's own brother was a photographer. But Bierstadt brought back a sense of what the West was like. This is the Yosemite Valley. And notice it's not uninhabited. There are Native Americans there. But there is this sense of paradise, of sublimity and quiet. And now both sky and water reflect only sunlight. Both these artists were inspired by an awareness that they were living in one of the most beautiful countries on earth. And also, sadly for us, their careless descendants, that it was their responsibility, our responsibility, to keep this beauty untarnished. In a great museum like Cleveland, there are some astonishing things, and one in particular was a revelation to me. In the West, it's only relatively recently that we've learned to appreciate nature as a thing of beauty in itself, and not as a mere backdrop for human activity. In the East, however, artists have always had a sense of the power of landscape, but in a completely different way than you might expect. In Western landscape painting, an artist controls a picture, dominates it, frames it. But this Chinese scroll is utterly different. I learned that I didn't need to know more to understand it. I just needed to know differently. Streams and Mountains Without End is by an unknown 12th century Chinese painter. These are all details from a scroll 7 feet long, but to unroll it and see it all at once would be barbaric. The point about a Chinese landscape scroll is that you're only meant to see a portion and to stay in that portion, not looking at it, but being in it, moving round it. For example, here you follow the path through the trees, and then you've gone behind that mountain into this little village. And then you move on, and you've come to higher mountains, and the little bay, and all the activities. You're not here on a journey to somewhere. You're on a stroll through the mountains. And everywhere you go, you have a path to and from, to move round and experience and enjoy and be at rest. Cleveland is famed for its Asian collections. This sculpture of Krishna was painstakingly reconstructed from fragments, some of which turned up in a garden in Belgium. If it weren't missing, you could see Krishna holding up the world in his strong left hand. This is Guan Yin, the Buddhist deity of compassion. The sculpture mixes two styles, Indian with the swirls of the dress and the bare torso, and Chinese with the use of gold leaf and decoration. But the great face, radiant with solicitous care, transcends both religion and nationality. Both these works are overwhelming, but by common consent with Clevelanders, one of the most popular pieces in the whole museum is this landscape by a 20th century American. This is a very unusual painting to find in a great museum, because it was only the second oil the artist ever painted. And it should have been the beginning of a glorious career, and yet somehow that never happened. John Rogers Cox was about 27 when he painted this, grey and gold, in the middle of World War II, for an exhibition in New York called Artists for Victory, and he won a minor prize. And then he painted a few more pictures and won other small prizes, and that's it. This early work seems to have been his peak. You can see where the grey comes from. It's that great ominous sky, clearly influenced, I think, by the fact that the war was raging. And then the gold. Those rippling fields of wheat, so manicured, so controlled, and the grass itself is so meticulously painted. And when we look at the surreal perfection of the field, we begin to feel distanced. Still more distanced by the fact that there's wire, a fence. He distances us. And this has a haunting quality. You know, in every museum, there are more paintings than there are walls. And I'm told that several times the curators have moved this and put it into storage, and there's been an outcry. By public demand, it's brought back again. And although he's unknown, you can understand why. It's a haunting picture. It must be a great struggle for the curators, having to decide what to leave in storage. And it's even harder on such a brief visit to know what to see and what to leave out. Two portraits that we haven't had time to see properly leave me with an abiding sense of the person behind the artwork. Goya's portrait of the accomplished architect and his personal friend, Don Juan Antonio Cuervo. And Hoto Kokushi, a Japanese monk who we know was born in 1203 and who lived for most of the 13th century. The big ears and pursed mouth of a real old man take away none of the feeling of serenity that the Guru must have had in his lifetime. But by common consent, this is without doubt the most important piece of Western art in the museum. in fact, not only one of the greatest paintings in America, but in the world. But I've seen people coming along this gallery, and when they come to it, they don't stagger and put a hand to their heart. They just walk on. It doesn't reach out and grab you. It's a very reticent picture. And I think that's because Poussin had, to the highest degree, two qualities that can seem contradictory. He was a great intellectual. He planned everything. He even made little models for his pictures to get them absolutely right. He imposed geometry on this haphazard world of ours. And I admit that can sound off-putting. But you see, also, supremely, he was a poet, a sensuous poet. There's all that hard, cold geometry of those horizontal steps, and in the great diagonals, vertically. It's a picture of what architecture can be, strong and sure and dead. Even the plants are trimmed or held in urns. And conquering this is another geometry, the soft, warm geometry of human beings, because that's a perfect triangle. On one side you have old St. Elizabeth with her son John reaching up. The apex is the Virgin and Child, and on the other side you have St. Joseph working. And then beneath that, on one side as if pushed away, you have two golden containers, almost certainly the containers for the myrrh and the frankincense that the kings, the wise men, brought to the crib when Christ was born. They're not wanted. What is wanted is the wicker basket of apples, which of course were called Eve and the loss of Eden. And one innocent, John, has picked up an apple and is handing it to another, as if to say that this is what holiness is all about, not rules and rigidities, but innocence and nature, sunlight, blue sky, what it means to be human.
Take a closer look at the works of art and museums featured in the program at www.pbs.org. The Sister Wendy's American Collection 6-video boxed set and the companion book are available from WGBH Boston Video. To place an order, please call 1-800-255-9424. Funding for this program was provided by the annual financial contributions to your PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is PBS.